That brings us to NDP 18. In the name of Mr. MacGregor / Mr. Julian.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and I would like to shout out to Alistair MacGregor for his work on this committee, of course, you know, and in drafting important amendments. This is an important one as well, I would say, and as we get to the end of the amendments, I think the committee has worked really effectively together. The reality is the clause in the bill as it currently is stated does shut down the possibility of people who are engaged in a rigorous and disciplined sport. And so what this amendment would do is expand from the International Olympic Committee and the International Paralympic Committee and include the International Practical Shooting Confederation and the Single Action Shooting Society. The International Practical Shooting Confederation, as you're aware, has a number of members in Canada. It is part of an international sports shooting association. There's about over 100 members countries, and many of those member countries include countries that have implemented handgun bans, and that is including the United Kingdom, New Zealand, and Australia. All of those countries, even after putting in place handgun bans, do allow members to train and compete in the International Practical Shooting Confederation events. So I voted against the Conservative amendment because it did open the door widely. The current law is very restrictive. This represents, I think, an ability for some people who engage in sports shooting in a very rigorous discipline to, as part of the International Practical Shooting Confederation, still participate in that sport. And it's potentially those are future Olympians as well. So this is a narrow focus. We've already passed amendments that allow for a rigorous criteria. What this would do is allow those members that are part of the International Practical Shooting Confederation to participate. And Alistair MacGregor, of course, has been a proponent for having a disciplined and a very rigorous application of the law, but allowing for those future Olympians and those who train to very rigorous standards through the International Practical Shooting Confederation to participate. So I would suggest this is in the same way that with airsoft we found a way through. We've ensured that the bill does comply with the highest standards, but with airsoft we have allowed for the government to set some regulatory framework. We've just adopted another amendment that allows the government, as Ms. Damoff has explained, to apply regulations. I would suggest that this amendment makes some sense. It doesn't open the door wide in any way, but it does allow for those who are part of a rigorous discipline sport to continue to participate. And as I mentioned, some of them may well be the Olympians of tomorrow. And when we look at other countries that have handgun bans in place, they have created an exemption for the International Practical Shooting Confederation. That seems to me to be a best practice that we can follow.
Thank you, Mr. Julian. Ms. Damoff.
Thank you, Chair. So I mentioned before that this is a policy area where the New Democratic Party and ourselves, and I know the Conservative Party, don't agree with. We had Ken Price from the Danforth families here, and I remember Ken saying it's a decision about how you want to move forward as a country, and so the Liberal government has put forward a bill that will freeze handguns. We haven't banned them. We have put forward a freeze, and in fact, will say, and I will give credit to Ken Price, because I remember very distinctly having a meeting with him, Chair, where he said, "Look, I would love to have handguns banned tomorrow. We had too much devastation on the Danforth, but maybe we freeze them, and it takes them out of circulation eventually." So the amendment put forward by the New Democratic Party would open up. We've already allowed an exemption for a pathway for potential Olympians, but even the International Practical Shooting Federation themselves have said that they expect their membership to grow considerably if there was an exemption that allowed them. And the concern, of course, is that people who want to get around the handgun freeze will join IPSC. And so the intent of being allowed to have an Olympic stream opens it up far too broadly. So I know that the New Democratic Party and Mr. MacGregor in particular felt quite strongly about this. But, you know, it's something we feel very strongly about. Ken Price said when he was here at committee, I'm just going to quote him, "In terms of a control measure, or being able to say what kind of guns should be used or not, or there being a risk with the number of those guns will grow because suddenly somebody is an IPSC elite shooter, we're just very skeptical that that could be managed. We think it undermines an objective that we have." So thank you to Mr. Julian for the work that he has put in on this committee and on this bill. But on this particular amendment, it's not one that we're going to be able to support. I would also remind colleagues that handguns are not something that I think the vast majority of Canadians, when they're polled, support what we're doing in Bill C-21. I see Mr. Kirk doesn't quite agree with me there, but that's the truth. That when you ask Canadians whether they support a freeze on handguns, they do support this. The idea that we need to expand what's in the bill after doing review within government as to the best path forward, we could have chosen a path that didn't allow this Olympic stream, but we decided that we would put this in there. There will be regulations developed over how that path moves forward, but it's very important that we move forward with this, that we decide what kind of country that we want to be, how safe we want to be. And while I know my Conservative colleagues don't agree with me on that, we feel that this is in the interest of public safety. And I think if you listen to what the Danforth families have said and listen to what they went through with a gun that was in a gun shop in Saskatchewan when it was stolen. This isn't a gun that was smuggled across the border. Sorry, how much time have I got, Chair? I've just realized I'm...
31 seconds.
Okay. It was a gun that was in Canada. So I will leave it there for now, Chair. Thank you.
Thank you. So, Mr. Blois, you have 15 seconds left.
Mr. Chair, I just, if I had more time, I would have given the perspective from rural Canada, from where I sit on this particular issue, but I probably have just a few more seconds. So unfortunately, I'll have to save that for third reading in the House. Thank you.
Unanimous consent to let him have some more he has to say?
Give him more time.
Yeah. There is a request for unanimous consent to give to give 5 minutes more time for another round, I guess, of questions, of answers.
Yeah, Mr. Chair, the way it works is it's another 20 minutes
Right.
by UC. I'm certainly willing to provide it.
I'm only asking for 5 minutes for Mr. Blois.
Well, it works, as Mr. Julian said. So do we have unanimous consent to extend another 20 minutes? No? Okay. That being the case, is there any further discussion on Mr. Lloyd, please?
Well, I, for one, was very interested in what Mr. Blois had to say. A Liberal perspective from rural Canada is an increasingly rare thing to hear these days in the halls of Parliament, and I thought hearing something like that would have been truly a very interesting thing to hear, but unfortunately the Liberal Party would not they muzzled their own member, wouldn't let him speak, but we are where we are. You know, this is not a move about public safety. You know, I understand the Danforth families, and I feel for them, and Ms. Damoff was correct. I mean, firearm stolen, a legal firearm in the hands of a killer. It was stolen from a gun shop. But we have an epidemic of smuggled firearms on the street. If it hadn't been a gun stolen from a gun shop, it would have been a gun smuggled in from the United States. These criminals are determined to get these firearms, and despite our best efforts, they are getting them. And more needs to be done. And, you know, Mr. Chair, am I able to offer my time to Mr. Blois?
I don't think that's within the spirit of the motion from the House.
Okay, well, I'll just continue on with what I have to say. Yep. Point of order. Is there anything, does the clerk have any perspective on that?
It requires unanimous consent of the House order to extend debate on an amendment.
Give our time. Can we cede our time? Yeah. Like a minute of our time. We quite often share during committee questions.
Just ask the advice.
With unanimous consent, we can do pretty much anything. So, do we have unanimous consent for some of the conservative time to be used by Mr. Blois?
Could we just suspend for a couple minutes, Chair?
Sure. We'll suspend at the call of the chair for a few minutes. The question is, the Conservatives have offered to give some of their time to Mr. Blois, and I believe if we have unanimous consent, we can do that. Do we have unanimous consent to do that? Agreed? Agreed. So, Mr. Blois, welcome, and you have 3 minutes and 52 seconds to speak.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And as you recognized, I'm not a permanent member of this committee, so I don't have the benefit of hearing all the testimony that the members would have heard throughout the study on C21 and, of course, the proposed amendments. But I do want to give a perspective from my riding, and I certainly appreciate where Ms. Damoff is coming from, and the idea that if we open up exemptions too far, it could undermine the government's policy intention, and I recognize it and I appreciate it, and I embrace the fact that we come from different parts of the country with different lived experiences, where we may approach this issue differently. Let me be very clear: this bill has a number of really important measures, and we need to get this through Parliament because it is going to make a difference for public safety. But I would be remiss without speaking to Mr. Julian's amendment, because I do think there is merit, whether or not in this amendment, but I hope that the government will consider ways to allow those who are competing competitively in other disciplines that are not Olympic sport shooting, such that there is recourse. I'll give you an example. Our former warden in the municipality of East Hants is Jim Smith. He actually appeared before this committee. He represents Canada and will participate around the world in IPSC-related events. One of his colleagues actually was just representing Canada and lost a handgun when Air Canada, the airline, actually lost the gun. Right now, there's no recourse for that gentleman to be able to actually obtain a new handgun and continue to compete. So I can actually, there's a tension on both sides of this, where I hear about the idea of a pile-in, and I think that is legitimate, and I think that has to be examined before we could move forward. But at the same time, as Mr. Julian had talked about, this is an internationally federated body. If there was one organization outside of the Olympic shooters that I think that this committee and indeed this government should consider, I think it's IPSC. And Mr. Julian went to great lengths, I think, borrowing from some of the work that Mr. MacGregor had done to highlight that
I'm here. stop the time? We seem to have a technical difficulty here. I'm sorry? Cliffhanger. I wonder what he was going to say.
Stay tuned next season.
Yeah.
Well, how much time? I can just pick up.
We may have to do that. I think we've lost him.
Yeah, he's logging back in.
Okay. Mr. Blois, you're back. So you have 1 minute and 20 seconds left.
The Tories are going to have fun with this one. They're going to make it look like somehow that my video get cut. No, but look, Mr. Chair, I just want to make sure that it's on the record. I appreciate where the government's trying to go with some of these elements, but I do think this is something that has to be examined. It'll be interesting to see as this goes back to third reading in the House, or whether or not it can be a regulatory measure. I don't want to penalize those that are actively competing or have a situation, whether or not it's a lost gun. You can appreciate these folks that actually shoot quite often. Sometimes their gun will actually just wear down and break. We have to have a provision for those who actually are gun owners today that are continuing to compete, that if something happens, they have some recourse. And I don't know the bill to that extent. I look forward to studying it prior to third reading at greater extent once we get through the amendments. But I want to make sure that perspective is on the table. And again, I brace it. I'm part of the team. I like what the government's doing on a lot of measures, but on this one, it is a bit difficult. And I do hope that moving forward, there can be a recourse, as Mr. Julian talked about. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Blois. So, Conservatives, you have 10 seconds left.
I just want to say that Mr. Blois brought up some very good points. And yes, I mean, this is a very punitive measure by the government. And if indeed we pass this motion or this amendment by Mr. Julian, and we find in a year or two that this is being used by criminals to threaten public safety, then let's revisit this. But at this time, there is no evidence that this is a threat to public safety, and so Conservatives will be in support of this amendment.
Thank you, and okay. Oh, Mr. Julian, go ahead.
How much time do I have left, Mr. Chair?
56 seconds.
Okay. 2 points. First off, the next NDP amendment prescribes minimum participation requirements for training, competing, and coaching in these disciplines, so a tight framework around this. Secondly, we are talking about a handgun freeze that is being put into place. A handgun ban in other countries is still allowed for participation from IPSC. So I would suggest we're not at the standard of countries like the United Kingdom, New Zealand, Australia, who have handgun bans, and yet they have found provisions for an exemption for IPSC. So I understand the arguments against. I think we have to go with best practices, and I think countries that have put into place a ban, which Canada is not doing, have allowed for exemptions for IPSC. I think that is a best practice that makes logical sense to follow.
Thank you, Mr. Julian. Okay, I believe there is no more discussion. So let us call a vote. All in favor? Well, actually, yeah, record division.
Ms. Damoff.
No?
Mr. Chang.
No.
Mr. Gahir.
Nope.
Mr. Blois.
I'm going to abstain.
Mr. Shifke.
No.
Mr. Keurig.
I'm in favor.
I'm sorry. Mr. Lloyd.
In favor.
Mr. Cram.
In favor.
Mr. Hoback.
Yes.
Madame Michaud. Contre. Mr. Julian.
Yes, I guess that goes to you, Mr. Chair.
Well, that's unfortunate. So the chair will vote with,
Do you want
I'm sorry? I think, I know the tradition is the chair votes to extend debate, but I'm not really sure how that works in this case. So I'm going to vote no.
yeas 5, nays 6.
So the amendment is defeated. That takes us to NDP 19. Mr. Julian, if you please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Well, heeding the words of Mr. Blois, the idea of having prescribed minimum participation requirements for training, competing, and coaching in these disciplines, as I've mentioned, other countries have exemptions for rigorous participation in sports shooting. Those countries have handgun bans. We have a handgun freeze. And so it seems to me to have the government hear what Mr. Blois and others have been saying about the possibility of putting in place regulations that allow for those future Olympians to participate makes sense. So I would suggest that NDP 19, we just had the closest vote on this issue that we've seen throughout this entire saga of now a year for C21. Right? A tied vote that you had to break, Mr. Chair, and I'm sure it was a difficult position that you were in. But I think that is a message to the government. What this amendment would do is provide for some framework around the government to potentially look at the message that they are receiving from the committee tonight, from 3 of the 4 parties, or members of 3 of the 4 parties. So I would suggest that adopting NDP 19 does allow for that rigorous framework, but also allows for the government perhaps to examine through regulation how they might look at some of the issues that have come up around sports shooting.
Thank you, Mr. Julian. Is there any discussion on NDP 19? Ms. Damoff.
Chair, we won't be supporting this amendment for the same reasons as I said before.
Mr. Lloyd.
I'm a bit confused because I actually thought that this amendment it needed the previous amendment to pass in order for this amendment to apply, but this is a standalone amendment, Mr. Julian, and I'm just wondering how this is a standalone amendment achieves what it's trying to achieve.
Mr. Julian, if you wish to respond.
Well, it opens the door for the government to look at regulation prescribed on minimum participation requirements.
Yeah, so I think you're giving a great deal of deference to the government to decide, which you would think the government would be willing to give itself the power to decide. I always think that prescribing these things in legislation is kind of a clumsy way of doing things because, as we know, things don't always play out cleanly when they're written down. Situations change, the names of organizations change. Mr. Cram was just talking about how Olympic sports will change over time, but I think generally, conservatives aren't against this amendment, and so we'll be we will be voting in favor.
Any further amendments? Sorry, any further discussion on this amendment? Seeing none, I guess we shall conduct the vote. I'm told that a hand-waving vote doesn't really work. It's kind of against the House rules that we set up way back when. So we're going to do a voice vote, I think. I have to figure out. Actually, can we? I think we'll have to have a vote on this. A recorded division. I'm sorry?
Point of order.
A point of order, Mr. Carrick?
So it's somewhat a point of information. I know we've found a great deal of success at other committees that if it doesn't pass on division, you just go to a recorded vote.
Well, that's a good approach. Right now, I think we'll just go to a recorded vote because I think we're going to need it. So please call the roll.
Ms. Damoff.
No.
Mr. Chang.
No.
Mr. Gahir.
No.
Mr. Lightbound.
No.
Mr. Shifke.
No.
Mr. Lloyd.
In favor?
Mr. Keurig.
In favor.
Mr. Cram.
In favor.
Mr. Hoback.
Yes.
Madame Michaud.
Contre.
And Mr. Julian.
Oui, yes.
Yeas pour 5, nays contre 6.
Thank you. The amendment is defeated.